Hello, welcome. My name is Thomas Pera, and I'm a workplace relations advisor and lawyer with the National Retail Association. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I will be the moderator for today's panel discussion on creating trans-inclusive workplaces. Before I begin, I wish to acknowledge that I'm presenting from the lands of the Jagera and Turrbal people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all attending from today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this meeting. I pay my respects to elders past and present and celebrate their ongoing culture and connections to the land. We meet today on Wear It Purple Day. Today, we're all encouraged to wear it purple to show our support for and celebrate LGBTIQ people, particularly young people everywhere. While this may seem like a really small gesture, for many young LGBTIQ people, seeing a sign of visible support can remind them that they're not alone. But today is also an opportunity to reflect and consider how we can stop and combat discrimination and oppression of LGBTIQ people. This aim is at the core of the day. And we should not forget that Wear It Purple Day was founded in 2010 in response to tragic deaths of a number of young LGBTIQ people after they were subjected to discriminatory bullying and harassment. As the largest employer of young people in Australia, the retail industry has a really important part to play in supporting LGBTIQ youth. Due to the discrimination that LGBTIQ people face, they experience unemployment and homelessness at higher rates than their peers. By creating more inclusive workplaces, we take an important step in combating this inequality. It's also important to note that workplaces can be an important site for growth, development, and connection with others. In fact, for some LGBTIQ employees, the workplace may provide the first space where that employee can feel comfortable to be themselves. The NRA takes diversity and inclusion seriously. We have a long history of advocating for equality and supporting more diverse workplaces. Encouraging diversity and inclusion in the workplace isn't just the right thing to do, but it also makes the industry stronger. Workplace diversity leads to diversity of ideas, which in turn allows for creativity and innovation. Studies show that when employers encourage diversity in their workforce and commit to inclusion, they outperform their competitors by around 50%. Many businesses have already taken major strides to make workplaces that are more inclusive of LGBTIQ people, but it's important for us to examine this more closely. While there have been benefits to unifying our community under the acronym of LGBTIQ, it can also obscure the nuances and different experiences of people represented in it. Today we come together to focus on the T, trans people. While many businesses will have gay or lesbian employees who are welcomed and included, trans people are still disproportionately excluded, unwelcomed, or discriminated against in the workplace. So, the NRA decided to do something. We recognise that one of the major barriers to supporting trans employees making them feel comfortable to be themselves in the workplace is that many employers lack awareness and education about what they can do. In some cases, businesses may just not have had the benefit of thinking about their workplace from a trans perspective, while some businesses may not even have had these larger discussions about gender. To support businesses to start taking the steps needed to make a more trans-inclusive workplace, we created our guide, Creating Trans-Inclusive Workplaces. It steps through important concepts and terms, some of the areas where employers often have trouble with, and how to practically implement steps towards a genuinely more trans-inclusive workplace. To launch the guide, we have the absolute privilege to be hearing from our distinguished panel, where we can talk about what they've witnessed and experienced, what barriers exist for trans people, and how employers can overcome these and create a genuinely inclusive workplace. Before I introduce our distinguished speakers, I want to encourage everyone to think about what questions they'd like to ask our panellists. There's a Q&A section down the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please enter your questions there. When we get to the end of the panel discussion, we'll put these questions to the panel and see how many we can answer with the time we have remaining. So, without further ado, I'd love to introduce our panelists, Stevie Lowe, Jade Mirabito, and Emmanuel Onley. So, I'll start with Jade. So Jade uses he, him pronouns and supports LGBTIQAP plus youth and trans people of all ages on the Gold Coast. Jade works for Headspace Southport, Relationships Australia Queensland, and is a service educator, providing LGBTIQAP plus focused training for individuals and organisations across Southeast Queensland. Jade is very passionate about bringing lived experiences into his multiple roles, identifying as agender, trans, queer, fabulous and femme. He enjoys community building, craft, and collecting teapots. Now, on to Emmanuel. Emmanuel started his journey at Lush Cosmetics as a sales assistant in the Doncaster store in 2013. After progressing through store leadership roles to a role in the customer care department, Emmanuel moved to the UK temporarily in 2016, where he used his lived experience of transitioning in the workplace to facilitate a series of trans inclusion workshops for several teams and departments within the Lush UK business. Emmanuel has recently joined the Lush Australia People Support Team and is passionate about fostering a warm and welcoming workplace environment where individuals of all identities are valued and celebrated. And last but not least, we have Stevie. Stevie is a 35-year-old trans person of colour living in Brisbane with 15 years of experience in the retail sector. Stevie responds to she, her pronouns and grew up in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, before migrating to Cairns in 1999 with her family, where she started her journey in retail and as a trans woman. Stevie has worked in a variety of roles within the retail sector, from checkout chick at Woolworths, customer service representative, and managerial roles with major international well-known brands. And through this experience, has seen the best and worst of people and what businesses, whether small or large, can do to bring trans inclusivity into the workplace. Outside of this, Stevie is also active in the LGBTIQ community through her involvement in community groups and activism work. And that's our incredible team of panelists. So I might kick things off, maybe with some of these. I mean, I'll of course let people step in if they want to, but I might stick with that order that I introduced you with and start with the first question. What is your journey through work and professional life looked like? And how has being trans shaped and played a role throughout? So can we start with you, Jade?
Sure. Hey, everybody. Interesting question. I guess for me, my trans identity has been fluctuating a lot over my life and over my workforce. So I've had a really lucky experience of most of my work roles have been in a queer organization or supporting queer people within the organization. I worked with the local university as a queer director for a few years. And I'm currently in a role which supports queer young people. But I did for a couple of years have a period of time when I worked as a support worker for a disability agency. And at that time, I was really quite worried about my employability as a trans person. And so I went stealth, which is when a trans person basically hides all sign of being trans and history of trans experience in the workforce. So the only person in that agency who knew that I was trans was the recruitment officer who took my details and my birth certificate. And everyone else saw me as a cis man, which was a very scary experience because there was always that constant fear of being outed. So that was a really interesting dynamic to go from being quite open about my identity to an industry where I was quite worried about people finding out. And then once I moved back into working as a queer person, specifically in a role where my lived experience was helpful and the main focus of my role, I definitely prefer the ones where I can be open and honest about who I am. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and how do you feel that, I mean, in terms of the energy and your ability to focus, I mean, what was the sort of experience between those sorts of two really distinct sort of experiences in a workplace?
I think in a role where I'm known by colleagues and within my role as an out trans person, um, there was less queer phobia that was sort of happening around me when I was living in that stealth role at an organization, uh, because people would assume that I wasn't part of the trans community, or in some cases even part of the queer community. There was often a lot of more openness around queer and homophobia and transphobia in the side comments and the conversations that happened around me with clients, with co-workers. So the energy that I had to employ to sort of deal with that definitely was a little bit distracting from the work that I was doing.
Yeah.
Mm.
Also, actually, I just realized we might want to explain. You have a beautiful Zoom background.
Oh yeah,
Could you explain for our audience a little bit about what this background is?
sure. I am using the non-binary flag in the same way that you're using the trans flag as your background. This is just one of many different varieties of flags that represent some of the other catchments of trans identities within the umbrella of trans. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. And yes, actually, like I'm presuming people may have worked it out in the course of promoting this event, but behind me is the, oh, wait, sorry, it's mirrored. Behind me, oh, I'm really struggling with mirroring. Anyway, behind me is the trans flag colours and sort of the trans flag in a stylized manner. But yeah, so good to know. And anyway, I might move on to Emmanuel. Would you like me to repeat the question or?
The question was, how has your professional and work-life journey been shaped by being trans? Is that right, Thomas?
Yes, that's it.
Great. Yeah, look, I would say that I think my professional journey has been very much shaped by me being transgender. Prior to my transition, I was actually an early childhood educator in my early 20s. I actually left the childcare sector and joined Lush Cosmetics and the retail sector because I didn't feel like I could come out and transition in that workplace. It didn't feel like a safe place to exist as openly LGBTQI. I'm fairly confident that I wouldn't be where I am today if I wasn't trans. But yeah, as you mentioned before, Thomas, I started as a sales assistant at the Lush Doncaster store. And when I told my manager that I'm transgender and I was going to be transitioning, I was so nervous and freaked out that I was shaking. I felt like I was going to be sick. I was a whole mess. And when I got the words out and told my manager, she actually burst out laughing and said, "Oh my gosh, I thought you were going to tell me something bad." So she was really supportive. In fact, the whole team were really incredibly supportive of my transition. And maybe that shouldn't have been as much of a surprise as it was, but at that time, I'd heard so many negative stories from other transgender people about not being supported in the workplace and not being made to feel welcome. So being supported like I was really gave me a lot more confidence. And it gave me the confidence to take on leadership roles within the store. I was eventually offered a 2IC role in a store in Sydney, so I moved into state for that. Joined the support team as a customer care team member, and yeah, from there went and lived in the UK for 2 years and joined Lush UK. At the request of my manager, I planned and facilitated a series of inclusion workshops, trans inclusion workshops, that were originally intended just for the customer care team in Lush UK, but we ended up expanding that out to other teams and other departments, and including company directors. Actually, it was a really eye-opening experience for me. But it was in the process of facilitating these workshops that kind of made me realize that I'm really passionate about supporting my colleagues in the workplace. So, when I returned to Australia after that and I had the opportunity to join the people support team here, it felt really serendipitous. So I think there's definitely been times in my life where I felt like certain doors have been closed to me due to me being transgender. But on the flip side of that, transitioning's opened up a lot of opportunities for me to discover passions that I didn't realize that I had. So swings and roundabouts, I am really grateful to where my journey has taken me at this point. Yeah.
That's really beautiful. I think what's also really interesting about that story that I think is also really valuable for people listening to take on board as well is that, there was a workplace, there was an industry where, you didn't feel comfortable there. And so you left. And now, respectfully, you're doing incredibly well, and that workplace that didn't create an environment where you felt comfortable lost that opportunity to have someone who is, as bright and exciting as you. So I think that's important.
Thank you.
For people listening to maybe think about in terms of, some of the many, many benefits of, creating a more trans inclusive workplace. So Stevie, I'd love to hear from you about how being trans has shaped your work, life, professional journey.
As you mentioned before, when I moved from Cairns, I was actually, still considered, I guess, male. I was always a very effeminate, I guess you could say, effeminate, even when I was a kid, growing up. And so through that, I didn't really, and because of Cairns is really, really small, and they had sort of one gay club, and it was a very small community, but I didn't have any sort of anything to kind of mirror what was going on here. So when I moved to Brisbane, and I was jobless for a little bit, but I started up with a big international company. It was a retail food donut company. If you know which, it's pretty big donut company, but up until sort of when I started transitioning, I didn't even have gay friends. So this journey was kind of all by myself and what I'd read online. I didn't even know, and because I wasn't too sure about where to find a community in Brisbane, it was basically just me going on my own transition through stuff that I've read online. And I was with that company for about 10 years, but I transitioned in between there. But I'm the kind of guns a-blazing kind of, I knew where I knew that they couldn't do anything. They couldn't fire me based off my gender, my race, or anything. So I knew that I sort of held that over them. So it didn't matter. It didn't really matter to me whether I told them I was transitioning or whatever. It was my issue and with my personal kind of journey. But I was really really, what's the word? Lucky, I guess, to have managers and assistant managers who were all supportive in that. And then there was also employees there who were really supportive in it. And I think just because of my guns a-blazing thing, no one kind of really wanted to confront me. So I'm really blessed in the fact that I've not been at a workplace that I felt like I was marginalized in any way. So yeah, and that's kind of brought me to this journey. So
Beautiful. So I will move on to our next question. So there are a number of terms that we often find people confuse, conflate, use interchangeably. Gender and sex, great example, transitioned or affirmed, transgender or transsexual. For you, what are some of the terms or concepts that you feel people, businesses really need to understand and use? And why does it matter? Can we start with you again, Jade?
Sure. So I don't want to take over and just go through each one of those lists. So I'm just going to I guess, focus on the sex/gender conversation. So I find when I'm working with organizations as a trainer, a lot of the time I'll be looking through forms, whether it's they're capturing data or there's referral forms. And there'll often be that unsurety of whether to ask for somebody's sex or ask for their gender, and whether it's like a tick box or an open dialogue box where you can just write in anything. And it always comes back to we need to be able to group everybody into boxes for data collection or for whatever the purpose is, which can be quite tricky when maybe you're asking the wrong question and not capturing the right information. So when you're asking for sex on a form, for example, what do you mean by that? In some cases, you might be asking what's on your birth certificate. In other cases, it could be the gender that you're going as, what do you need and what are you asking? Often when they ask for sex, they only offer male or female as the two options, and completely ignore the whole range of intersex people that exist. And often the sex and the gender are sort of grouped together, and intersex isn't mentioned at all. So when we're looking at sex, for example, sex is a combination of your hormones, your chromosomes, your physical features, and all of those things together. And we have this issue in Queensland specifically that if you want to change your sex on your birth certificate, you have to go through forms of surgery that you may not actually want to do to change that paperwork. And because the surgeries are so expensive, most people won't have access to some of those surgeries. And those requirements mean that you may not be able to change your birth certificate. And therefore, when you're filling out forms, for example, you'll have so many different forms of paperwork that have different details on them, whether it's one of the old licenses when we used to still have sex on there and you could change it. It's quite complicated. So for me, when I think about the differences between gender and sex and capturing that information, it's really about what you're wanting to capture. And if you are wanting to capture sex, for example, are you then going to put in place all of the different chromosomal variations that people have to capture that accurately? And if you're not, are you going to do something else to try and find a way to capture it? Because if you're not capturing everything within that group, then you're not getting the data that you need. Yeah. And with intersex people being around 1.7% to 2% of the population, that's a huge chunk of people who are being missed out. And I think the little thing that I want to tag on is that unless you've had testing or unless there's some sort of physical variation that's been noticed, you could be an intersex person and not be aware of that. And so often when they do ask about intersex variation, it's a case of, yes, you're intersex, no, you're not intersex, but there's not really an I don't know box, which most of us should be ticking unless we actually do know.
Exactly. Yeah, we all kind of just assume oh yeah, should be all right. And yeah, there's absolutely stories of people years later actually, just randomly getting testing, maybe something, something's going on with their body and they get some tests done. And it's so you actually have this body part you didn't know you had.
Well, the chromosome variations, that's a really common one because no one really gets chromosome testing at all. Yeah, so when you do get that done, like I often do this little quiz when I train services, and I'll get people to raise their hands if they've ever had a chromosome test. And we'll usually get maybe one person out of the whole group, and it'll be related to fertility things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's actually not useful, really. Like, well, it's this obsession with like trying to identify and lock down someone's sex is really a bit of a red herring, or it's a bit of a, you know, not particularly helpful. Maybe it's actually
Totally.
helpful to almost, you know, probably just to ask about people's gender and, you know, maybe put some. I think there are certain things a lot of organisations do need to track that information for, and it does allow organisations. It's important. It's an important question to ask in terms of, you know, what is your organisation's, you know, workforce diversity like? Is it you know, is it proportional to, is it representative, you know? But at the same time, you can do that in ways that include everyone.
Definitely. My favorite is always going to be that blank box. Just fill it out yourself and go from there.
What about you, Emmanuel? Can I call you Mems?
Yes, you absolutely can. A lot of people do. Yes. Yeah, I guess like language is such a wonderful, marvelous thing. I know it really helped me early in my transition to be able to have the words to describe my experiences and to find other people that relate to those experiences. But like, I also understand that it's, especially when it comes to terms that people are unfamiliar with or terms that have evolved significantly in recent years, sometimes it can be really hard to know like what will help and what will harm. I think one of the really big ones that that this becomes really obvious to me is like LGBTQI versus queer. So a lot of people self-identify as queer, and that's awesome. But up until quite recently, like queer has been historically used as a slur, and for a lot of the members of the LGBTQI community, it's a word that still holds a lot of trauma. And a lot of violent connotations. So it can be really difficult. Like it's probably that's probably one of the words that you don't want to use in reference to somebody unless you know that that's a word that they use to self-identify. I think certainly in a professional context, it's safest to use LGBTQI over queer to refer to the community. Transgender versus transsexual is another big one where that comes up, because like I think a lot of trans people would definitely prefer the term transgender and identify more closely with that term, and see the word transsexual as outdated and to some kind of offensive. But 30 years ago, that was the word that the trans community had to, you know, refer to ourselves. And there's just been so much kind of growth and development since then. So I think it's definitely in a professional context, like transgender is the one that you want to be using. But yeah, there are people in the trans community who do still use the word transsexual to self-identify.
Yeah. I think I might move on to the next question. I'm just conscious of time.
Oh, sure.
So one of the first hurdles that a lot of trans people in the workplace face is recruitment, actually getting a job. I wanted to see what you all thought some of the changes or steps that employers could take are to move towards a more trans-inclusive recruitment process. Stevie, what are your thoughts?
Great question. I love this question. My idea, because we have to approach this as if this person has not had any sort of contact with the trans like individual, right? So my understanding of most people who haven't had limited contact with the LGBTQI community is that basically their shared sort of experiences, whether that's in person or that's via like TV or media, their idea of what a group of people are. So in my instance, I always found that men always thought that I was an escort, straight up. They just thought that, and like there's no, and that was just an idea that was just placed there by sort of society. So I always found it my prerogative to say, look, not everyone is a sex worker. Not everyone comes from it. Like it's sort of a different kind of, how would you say?
Journeys?
Yes, yeah. And everything's so unique in the fact that you can't just group like, oh, all these trans people, they all have the same shared experience. We're all so different that it's almost like it's crazy. Each story, like with Jade or Mems, like we all are kind of collective in the same, where they're all trans or on the trans spectrum, but at the same time our journeys are completely different, that it's ridiculous, right? So the ways in counteracting that is baby steps, because we can't just kind of flood them with this, but just starting off as a little step, like just an option would be great, and whenever I really enjoy going into a place where they go male, female, or as Jade said, they have that blank box. Like that's my favorite thing. Unfortunately, in cases like where you have to, like say in Queensland, I've recently gotten my passport, actually about a year or two ago, but when I had to get it, they do give an option to put X as your gender, but you're going to have issues when you're traveling to other countries like Abu Dhabi or, those countries that don't recognize, I guess, trans people as a kind of
people.
Yes, exactly. People at all. Yeah. So, like I had to put myself down as male because I did not want to have that issue when I'm traveling. But I'm someone who I don't really care what you call me, as long as you call me. So basically that's it. So, and it's a tough one. I mean, I think, I heard on the news recently that, now, you don't have to have the operation to change your gender, but don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure I just heard it. I got really excited about it, but it's something that I've yet to look into because
it tends to depend on what state you're in. Different states
yeah.
and territories have different approaches as to how, at what point, or what you need to do that. But I think what I sort of pick up from you, I think, is that maybe the main takeaway is maybe not making assumptions.
Yes.
And appreciating that, everyone is unique, everyone has a different experience.
Yeah. But just having, I guess, that option, right?
Yeah, wild assumptions. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm particularly keen to hear from you, Mems, on this, because you actually do recruitment.
I do. That's my whole job. Yeah. I think, to be honest, one of the things that really irks me as a trans person is gender tick boxes on applications and on onboarding processes. It's really, it is kind of an exclusionary thing to kind of, when you're applying for a job to be confronted with okay, pick one, male or female, or male, female, other. It's not great. It's not ideal. I would say scrap it if you can as an employer. If you really need that information for recording diversity of applicants or employees, then I think it's really it's really vital to make sure that your options aren't just male and female. Have a free text box, as Jade mentioned earlier, or have a range of options that at least can mostly encompass the spectrum of human experience, because male and female just doesn't cut it. I would then take that mindset and look for anything else in your recruitment and screening processes where gender is coming into it in any way, and just challenge why it's there. Really, it's I think what's really important, though, when you're looking at improving the inclusivity of your recruitment processes, is to remember that it's not just like, okay, well, I did that, so we're good now. It's a constant process of like reviewing, seeking feedback, reassessing, and thinking about what can be improved.
Yeah. I'm keen to hear, so some employers may be uncomfortable or unsure about how and when to discuss things like someone's pronouns or their trans identity. When do you think it's appropriate for an employer to maybe raise these questions? How should they approach that question? I mean, should they even, should they inquire first, or should they actually wait for someone to disclose? I'm keen to hear from you, Jade.
Sure. I find with the work that I do is often about trying to find the right time to have those questions. And it comes down to how open and inclusive the workspace is to begin with. Do trans people feel safe there? Something that I think is really important, especially for both the previous question and for this question, is making sure that your workplace is somewhere that trans folk would actually want to work. And how do you promote your workplace to be a trans inclusive workspace? Being able to ask questions can be really important, but it often comes down to whether the question you're asking is for your benefit or for their benefit. And if you're finding that you're getting more out of asking that question, maybe it's possibly a question to seek information from Google or from different services that cover this, so that it's not putting the labor on the person who's working for you in that awkward power dynamic already, to constantly provide information on how to best look after their needs. With those sort of individual things, as Stevie was saying before, we're all individuals and we all have different needs. So it's good to be able to have that open dialogue. But it's around, I guess, managing those power dynamics and making sure that you're not putting on an extra amount of work on someone to do a job that's on top of what they're currently doing within the time frame that they're doing it.
Absolutely. What about you, Stevie? What are your thoughts in terms of, having these discussions? Is it for you or is it for your employer? How should that be approached?
Well, I think it comes back to, I guess, this that little tick box, so that as a manager, as in my manager shoes, I would, if that person felt comfortable, if they disclose it on their form, I'm assuming that they would feel comfortable discussing it in a private, say, one-on-one interview, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That would seem like the most logical thing for me to kind of. But I'm a very sort of open person, so people kind of disclose that information, and it's something that when I was applying for jobs, I would have to tell people that, look, I'm trans, so if you get a Stephen on your books and then a Stevie comes in, that's me. But I really shouldn't have to do that. But I'm confident in who I am to do that. But
not everyone might.
That little tick box, do you know what I mean? I should, if I felt like I was going under Stevie and I was trans, then the person who's interviewing me should be able to ask those questions without me feeling marginalized at all. So
what about you, Mems?
I think what's really important is not making assumptions, based on the way that somebody looks or the way that they present. I think what Jade mentioned earlier about creating a really inclusive workplace is a really inclusive workplace culture is so important. Just kind of having a culture where the sharing of pronouns is normalized for everyone is so valuable. It makes it so much easier. in like a practical sense, something that we've had a lot of success with in Lush is actually having little pronoun badges made. I don't know if you all can see that I've got one on.
Yeah.
So we actually had these made and gave them to new team members and existing team members as well. And that was really successful and really popular with our staff and our team members. But of course, if you're going to do that, it's so important to have like a full range of pronouns. You don't want to be missing one. Another thing that's like a practical thing that's really good for creating that inclusive culture is adding your pronouns to your email signature and it encourages other people to do the same, and it normalizes the concept of sharing your pronouns as you would share your name. So I think those kind of practical things can help a lot as well.
That's it. It's really normalizing those discussions and making them more okay. I think I'd like to also ask something that's, a bit more difficult is, hostility or ignorance in the workplace. Unfortunately, trans people in the workplace will find people who might be rude, hostile, or, not supportive of them. How would you recommend employers deal with these employees who are resistant to respecting someone's gender, pronoun, or name? Jade?
Sure. I think with this one, it's a bit tricky. Like, you will always have your anti-bullying and anti-harassment policies and procedures, and those would be things that you would have to follow. And any transphobia or microaggressions towards trans people would fall under that. And so addressing those in the same way that you would address any workplace bullying would be the way to go. The tricky part would be addressing your own biases within your own understanding of the trans experience. If you personally don't believe that what's happening is offensive to a trans person, or actually workplace bullying because of your own belief around that, whether it's using toilets, you're like, oh, well, no, that makes sense as to why that person feels this way and said that thing. That's going to make things difficult for the workplace to be a supportive environment for trans people. So not only is it a matter of ensuring that you're following the proper workplace procedures, but also analyzing your own thoughts and opinions and doing training with other people who are in those higher up roles who deal with workplace bullying and harassment, so that these issues, when they come to light, aren't dismissed.
Yeah. And what about you, Mems?
I think that if somebody's resistant to respecting a colleague's identity or name or pronouns, I think understanding the cause of that resistance is really important. If it's just that person has decided in their heads that they just don't like the concept of trans people, and therefore they're going to take any opportunity to show disrespect to their colleague by using the wrong name and using the wrong pronouns, then as Jade said, that's bullying, and it needs to be treated as such because that creates a toxic work environment for everyone. On the other hand, though, if there's genuine confusion on the right words or the right name, or the resistance is caused by a fear of getting it wrong, then I do think that it is an employer's responsibility to meet that with understanding and support in the form of training and education to ensure that that employee is equipped with the tools in the form of language and confidence to communicate effectively with all of their colleagues. And sometimes it can be really hard to tell at first if somebody's being inappropriate for malicious reasons, or if it's almost like a defense because they're afraid of being wrong. So having a conversation with that employee is really important to get to the bottom of like what's actually going on. I think it's just so vital not to put that conversation off because you're afraid that it's going to be awkward, Additionally, I cannot stress enough how important it is to not put the responsibility on the trans employee whose identity is being disrespected to work it out with the colleague who's not showing them appropriate respect. That's Not a good idea. It's very stressful for the trans employee, and it's also very likely to cause conflict.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant advice. Like, to sort of flip it to something a bit more maybe exciting. I think the benefits of an inclusive workplace are often, talked about. I talked about it at the start of this. There's a number, what are some of the unique viewpoints or benefits you feel that you bring or that you've brought to workplaces being a person with a lived experience of being trans? I'm keen to hear from you, Stevie.
Oh gosh. I would say, gosh, so don't mind me while I'm just going through 10 years of history.
Do you want me to come back?
Come back to,
Yeah, sure. Jade, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, okay. I guess I'm quite lucky because my role is specifically using my lived experience to support and enhance the workplace and to connect with the clientele who are also part of the community. So that sort of rapport building is a really key part of my role and really helpful. Having trans employees is great. The forms of connections that we have with fellow trans people can really enhance the workspace. And even if you're in a role where you're not meant to be working with other trans people, having trans employees encourages other trans employees to come and join the workforce and enhances the workplace environment substantially. I know that from lots of personal stories that I've been told from people who have been trying to get into employment, one of the main reasons that they would try and choose one job over another if they're being offered two was one workplace had trans people working there already and the other place hadn't mentioned that at all. And even in the case of like higher and lower paying jobs, people were choosing the jobs that had other trans people working there, even if it meant taking a pay cut. So having trans employees in general is a really great way to enhance that positive workplace environment, and just having that sort of peer support and conversation with one another in my role has been incredibly helpful in being able to connect. Yeah.
What about
I think it's important not to forget also the friends of trans people, because I've had friends go, I went into a makeup counter. I kind of, because I know you're trans, and I was more likely to buy from that counter again, or I was likely to buy from that brand because I know that they hire multiple trans people to, and we forget that we have a network of friends and family that support us, and they will hop behind a brand as well, which is really important. We forget about that kind of like that tree of support. Yeah, that network, which we always bring to everything, that network. So I guess that's one thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I wanted to move on to maybe something a little bit more harder to read. So obviously we've talked about it can be easy to find, some explicit transphobic behavior, someone just refusing to use the correct pronouns. But there's also a lot of implicit or indirect ways that trans people can be discriminated against in the workplace. What are some of the examples that come to mind for you, and how can employers proactively identify and address these issues? Mims, could you speak to that?
Sure. I think a lot of the small things are things that are kind of built into systems and processes, but they're so normalized we don't necessarily notice how exclusionary and insidious they are. I mentioned gendered tick boxes in recruitment and onboarding earlier. That's a big bugbear of mine. Another one is situations like when an employee's chosen name is respected by their employer and their teammates in principle, but the name on the sign-in software is their dead name because it has to match the name on their payslip, which has to match the name on their tax return, which has to match their name on government records, things like that. And of course, like bathrooms. I think, everybody in this discussion who knows a trans person is probably aware of how often bathrooms can be such a massive stressor in the workplace. Being able to access a bathroom safely is something that so many of us just take for granted, and it's just not that easy for a lot of transgender people. I knew a retail employee who shared with me that they worked in a major shopping centre and they were actually repeatedly stopped from using the bathroom that fit their gender identity by the centre security guards because the shopping centre security guards saw fit to challenge their gender identity.
Oh my God, yeah.
And like, that's not an example. That's not really an example of indirect discrimination. That's pretty direct, to be honest. But it's an extreme example of the kind of scrutiny and exclusion that trans people often face just going to the loo. So yeah, that's something that I see a lot in workplaces. I think the burden is too often as well on the transgender employee to point these issues out. And that's so exhausting. Like, I've been that person. You feel like you're nagging. You feel like you're always being a downer because there's always something, I think like the responsibility really does need to be put back onto us as employers to be more proactive about the safety and well-being of all our staff, looking for these things and not just putting them in the too hard basket when we see them, like being more solutions focused about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What about you, Jade?
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of those sort of those issues come at the cost of like jokes and commentary. Like, it's often quite innocent where they're just gendered jokes or jokes that don't include or are jokes at the expense of diversity.
Yeah.
And the way in which our events run. So if we have the sort of, I guess, productivity, social building, team gathering events, and maybe they'll be like, okay, we're going to go do this sport activity as a bit of a thing, and it'll be, girls versus boys, for example. And that's a really common way to split the room for quizzes and other things. And those things can be really isolating, especially if you're one of the variations of non-binary trans people who don't identify as men or women. When they get split into that sort of binary two dynamic, it can be really isolating and uncomfortable. Often we get outed to other clients or maybe other people who work with us, our peers, and it's unintentional, or maybe they think, oh, well, because I know, then other people might know, or maybe somebody new has joined, and that sort of outing process where they're taking the onus away from us to be able to share our journeys ourselves. And maybe they're sharing in ways that might put us at risk. Especially if we are talking about toilet use and seeing somebody, if you're in the toilet, open the door and then close the door and think that they're maybe in the wrong toilet based on that, can be quite stressful. I guess in regards to what Mems was saying with toilets, as an agender person, I don't fit into any of those the toilet options. And so when I go to a toilet in a public space, there's rarely an option for me that feels safe. And if there's maybe one that's the wheelchair accessible toilet, that might be the one that I go for, because if I go into the men's toilet, which is probably the one that I would choose if I had to, I'm very much at risk, being as femme as I am, for direct attacks and verbal stuff. And if I were to go into the women's, I would feel uncomfortable about invading a woman's space, like an autonomous women's space, as somebody who doesn't identify as a woman. So yeah, having access to toilets is a really intense experience, and in the workplace, having, you know, maybe a policy that's like, oh yeah, well, if you're trans, you just go to the toilet of your choice, doesn't always work if you're not a binary trans person, based on all of those things that I've already said.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think what I'd like to sort of do before, we might have time for a question or two, but before opening, you know, looking at those questions, I'd like us to sort of maybe go around everyone and maybe see if you've got one key lesson, piece of advice, top tip, you know, for employers to start implementing in their business and, you know, making a trans inclusive workplace. Stevie.
I would say education, top thing that a manager, if not, they do it for themselves. When it starts to become a sort of more apparent in media about trans or, you know, these sort of issues around gender, as a manager, you should probably, you know, teach yourself. Do you know what I mean? And it can't come down to the excuse of like, oh, I didn't know, you know, but really,
we all have the same Google.
Exactly. That's my one tip. Like, just educate yourself, because the only person that's gonna look like an idiot is basically you. So,
what about you, Mims?
I think that my number one tip is just don't be daunted by the process of creating an inclusive workspace. It's not as daunting or big and scary as you might think. Like, it might involve challenging some ideas or some perceptions that you've held for some time, but honestly, that's not a bad thing. I would say try not to overthink the process of trans inclusion, because at the end of the day, it's just about making everybody feel welcome and valued. And that's something that we all want from our workplaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Jade, what's your top advice?
Yeah, I think Stevie's mentioned before that all of us are quite different and we have varied experiences. So just because you may have a local trans person who says it's okay to do something doesn't mean that it's going to be okay for everybody to do, or for you to do with other trans people. And don't use your trans friend as maybe an excuse to harm us or to misgender us or to speak about us in past tense if you knew us before we transitioned or affirmed our genders. And when it comes down to like confidentiality, often we're a very small community, even though there's a lot of us. So if you're going to be sharing stories of a trans person that you know to another trans person, if you're sharing personal details, the amounts of times that I've been training services and providing that education, and they'll tell me personal stories about people that I realize halfway through, oh, yeah, that's my friend, or that's the person that I was dating. And we're all very interconnected, even if we're across the states of Australia. So again, making sure that you're not sharing stories that aren't yours to share, and that even if you don't use somebody's name, we're probably going to know who you're talking about. Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one question. Beck, can you maybe choose one? Lucky dip, and we'll put it to the panel.
We've got some actually very tremendous questions here. So anyone who doesn't get chosen, please feel free to email through your questions and we'll try and answer them afterwards.
Yep.
For the sake of retail, I think let's talk about, are trans employees in retail more likely to be subject to customer abuse? What does the panel recommend retailers do to minimise harm to their trans team?
I'll start with Stevie.
I have been subject to this, and it all depends on the kind of workplace that you're in. I was lucky in the fact that there was a large counter separating me from that person, but I always look at it as you can't control what the customer does to you, or what they say to you, but you can control what you do and how you present yourself. And as a trans if you're as a trans employee, you should be able to uphold the company's kind of policies and beliefs. And your manager should be able to back you up by saying, like, being your backup, basically. It's when that backup kind of drops behind you and you're kind of left alone that you feel you feel a lot like attacked, I guess. But I'm blessed in the fact that I've had the last 2 workplaces back me up on my on this customer just being being the wonderful person that they probably are outside of my workplace. But yeah.
Yeah, so I suppose, like, backing up your employees,
Exactly.
being there to support them.
Yeah.
What about you, Mims?
I think Stevie's absolutely right. Like, it's so important for employees to feel, I guess, like, safe and supported in addressing transphobia if it occurs in their store. So it's really important for companies to be proactive in, I guess, sending that message to employees on, like, look, we don't tolerate this kind of behaviour in stores, and if you are faced with this kind of behaviour, this is what you do. I also think that it's helpful if the store is able to make that message public as well, and just kind of send the message to everybody that, that kind of behaviour is not going to be tolerated in our store. And if you get booted out for being rude to a trans employee, like, you were warned. Something Lush did quite recently, which made me really excited and proud to be a part of the company, is popped a sign in all of our store windows saying, please don't enter with signs of COVID-19, racism, homophobia, sexism, or transphobia, which was a really lovely way to send a bit of a PSA to everybody about, like, what is and isn't tolerated in terms of behaviour in our stores. And I think that's really vital to make sure everybody is confident in addressing it when it does come up.
Yeah, beautiful. And Jade, would you like to finish us off?
I guess I don't work in retail, so I'm happy for Mems and Stevie to have said what they've said.
Okay.
I guess I just support those things, and making sure that, again, if you're a workspace that trans people want to work at, that's because there's a public perception of you being a trans-friendly space. Hopefully, if that's the case, customers will also be aware that that's a space where trans people are supported and loved.
Yeah, beautiful. That's a really beautiful way to finish off. I'd just really love to thank all of the people who've tuned in and registered. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. We definitely will endeavour to get back to all of you. And I'd love to thank our incredible panellists. That was such a beautiful hour of discussion around how employers can, make trans people feel more included and supported in their workplaces. Thank you. And I hope everyone has a really beautiful day. We'll be sending out a copy of the guide today. And I hope you're all, everyone has a really lovely Wear It Purple Day.